and agree to the resolution House 1457.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 1457, resolution expressing the sense of the House of Representatives on the one-year anniversary of the government of Iran's fraudulent manipulation of Iranian elections, the government of Iran's continued denial of human rights and democracy to the people of Iran, and the government of Iran's continued pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa, and the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Ross-Lehtinen, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous materials on this resolution under consideration.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of this resolution today and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you again, Madam Speaker. House Resolution 1457 expresses the sense of the House of Representatives on the one-year anniversary of the government of Iran's manipulation of the Iranian elections, the continued denial of human rights, and the continued pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability. And I'd like to thank my friend, Judge Poe, Congressman from Texas, for joining me in the introduction of this important resolution. Madam Speaker, just over a year ago, on June 12, 2009, the world watched as Iran's rulers manipulated and stole an election for their chosen candidate, Mohammad Ahmadinejad. Thousands of the Iranians took to the streets following that sham presidential election for the regime that had been orchestrated. Following that, we all know what happened. So the anniversary, we speak in this resolution on the anniversary of that disputed election result, because I believe, and those who are supporting this resolution believe, that Congress must reaffirm its commitment to supporting democracy and freedom around the world, and including in Iran. We know as the street protests continued against that fraud election, and it intensified, that the government of Iran, its riot police, its members of the Revolutionary Guard Corps engaged in a brutal crackdown of the Iranian people. Sadly, many Iranians were injured, imprisoned, or killed. Human rights in Iran, we know, have deteriorated precipitously over the years since the first election of President Ahmadinejad. And since that disputed presidential election last year, Iran's slide into what is clearly a brutal dictatorship has sharply accelerated. Iran's Revolutionary Guards, its militia, its police arbitrarily arrest thousands of peaceful protesters and dissidents, including students, women's rights activists, lawyers, and journalists, in a clear effort to intimidate and stifle their dissent. This regime obviously cannot withstand these critics. But as champions of freedom and democracy, the United States must condone these abuses of this Iranian regime whenever possible, as we witness such actions around the world. It is in our Constitution, and it is one of the reasons why we still remain a beacon of light around the world as we stand up for human rights that have sadly been abused in Iran by this regime. But it's not just in our Constitution. In the Quran, it states, "Help one another in a righteousness and goodness way. Help not one another when in sin and aggression." Clearly, this despotic regime in Iran is engaged in full-time sin and aggression of its own people. But this quote, of course, is from the Quran, which is the book of the major religion of the people of Iran. And yet they violate their own faith in this way. Madam Speaker, the people of the United States stand behind the people of Iran, who simply want to live their lives in peace and freedom, free of the brutal oppression of their government. Let us be clear at the end of the day. Mohammed Ahmadinejad is nothing more than a bully and a dictator. His regime uses every tactic they can to subdue and terrorize their own people. And we need to recognize this phony regime for what it is. It's a killer of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of press. And I believe that when history is written, that the record of this terrorism regime in the 21st century will compare, sadly, to those same brutal dictatorships that we witnessed in the 20th century. I'm talking about Hitler, Stalin, Tojo, and Mussolini. That is the level of despotic dictatorship that we are witnessing today in Iran. So therefore, this resolution before us confirms Congress's support for all Iranian citizens who struggle for freedom, human rights, and civil liberties. It condemns the ongoing violence and human rights abuses against the people of Iran by their government and urges immediate release of all political prisoners detained by this regime. House Resolution 1457 also calls for the freedom and democracy for the people of Iran, including fair, democratic, and independent elections, unlike the ones that were held a year ago. Finally, this resolution condemns the government of Iran's continued pursuit of nuclear weapons capability and a ballistic missiles program, for clearly we know what they are intended for. This is especially timely, Madam Speaker, since later this week the House is expected to vote on the Conference Committee report H.R. 2194. We hope by the end of this week, certainly by next week. The Iran Sanctions Accountability and Disinvestment Act of 2010 is an important measure. I'm proud to be a conferee on the Conference Committee. This piece of legislation represents, I think, a monumental step toward our fight against Iran's nuclear proliferation. These sanctions reinforce and go far beyond the enacted United Nations sanctions aimed at persuading Iran to change its conduct that was voted on over a week ago. These tough new petroleum and financial sanctions will restrict the ability of Iran's regime and its thugs to continue their nuclear aspirations and their oppression of the Iranian people. The legislation also increases penalties for sanction violations and bolsters the U.S. trade embargo against Iran. These sanctions will send a strong signal that our nation will not stand for the escalation of this regime's aims at a nuclear arms program, especially with violent threats against our strategic ally Israel and the threat of that ally and its impact throughout the regions of Europe and Southeast Asia, along with the Middle East. Clearly, their medium-range missiles are capable of reaching all of those countries within that area, and therefore we stand with Israel and our allies. These sanctions are a powerful step forward. We must continue to take all necessary actions and to keep every option on the table to prevent nuclear arms races in that region. Madam Speaker, I encourage my colleagues to support this important resolution and to send a strong message to Iran and the entire world that America will not stand by while these human rights abuses continue and they continue to pursue nuclear weapons capabilities. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Judge Poe, an esteemed member of our Committee on Foreign Affairs.